Good evening. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming on this cold evening. The stories, usually family sagas, tend to be from rags to riches, but actually here it's somewhat different in the sense it starts with riches, then it goes to rags, then to riches, then a decline. And one of the things that we need to understand that this is really a typical story of a survival of an immigrant family and what it meant to be Jewish refugees in a foreign land. So what is the story? It all started in Baghdad, where the community lived for more than 2,500 years. The Sassoons actually were not traders in Baghdad. The father of the founder was the representative of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire as his tax collector. But in 1830, a corrupt governor arrived in Baghdad and began to embezzle money from merchant and wealthy families, and the Sassoons were one of them. David Sassoon, who founded the dynasty, and his father fled Baghdad in 1830-31, not because of anti-Semitism, as at the time was reported, but really more because of this corrupt governor. This is the founder, David Sassoon. He fled Baghdad, he went to Persia. He lived for a year, his father died there, and then made a decision to go to Bombay. And it was really an interesting decision because didn't have any family, didn't have anyone. The main aspect and the main reason that he decided to go to Bombay because he heard stories that actually it's a free place, that there is no one that thinks of religion or sect, and that you can survive there and work and prosper. And he proved to be right. I never really was interested in writing the history of the family. I work on the Middle East, but I came across an incredible treasure of documents. I found all the correspondence of the family at the National Library in Jerusalem. Tens and tens of thousands. Why were they not used before? Simple reason. You need to know 3 languages to decode it. This is in Baghdadi Jewish dialect, which means you need to know the Baghdadi Jewish, you need to know Arabic, and it's in Hebrew letters. Of course, there is the 4th dimension, which is really the handwriting. This is typical. Notice there are no paragraphs. I translated and put paragraphs. There are no paragraphs. There are no bullet points. It begins in a very, very formal way. It ends in a formal way, but then it moves from one thing to another about business, and in the middle, suddenly it changes to talk about social news of the family. That is really what made me do that. And part of that, what I call the hidden history, is discovering things that really very few have written about the Sassoons. One of the most important elements is the discovery that a woman run a global trading firm at the end of the 19th century. I later on found that actually, if you look at the end of the 19th century, there were a lot of matriarchs in America, in Europe, in Asia, but not a CEO who was running a global firm on a daily basis. And you cannot believe how sophisticated the business was by the 1890s. From the beginning, being refugees, David Sassoon decided to identify with the British. He felt it's the only superpower. This is the empire he wants to be part and parcel. 1853, he is granted British citizenship, although he never went to Britain, and he actually never learned English. He learned Hindustani in addition to Arabic, Hebrew, Persian, and Turkish, but not English. He made sure all his children are tutored by English tutors, but he never learned. One of the fascinating things is also he could never understand is why he is swearing allegiance not only to a sovereign, but also to a company, a stock company. The simple reason is East India Company was in charge of running India until 1857. One of the things that once he settled and began trading first cotton and then other commodities, including opium, rice, silk, tea, his first wife they had 4 children. She died very young age after the delivery of their 4th child. A year later, he married, and his second wife, they had 10 children, 10 who survived. So in total, he had 14 children. And I argued that this really was a small army to develop an incredible network around the globe. This is the main character. There are many other characters. David Sassoon, his first son Abdullah. By the way, all of them anglicized their names at some point. The second son, Elias, who opened China, who went and explored there. Farha, this is the CEO that I was talking, who comes later. And then in Shanghai, later on, the last of the Sassoons, of the Grand Sassoons, Victor Sassoon, who controlled a huge real estate empire in Shanghai until World War II. One of the things David Sassoon did from the beginning, training his children, sending them at a very young age back to Baghdad, back to travel, learned the Arabic language because you needed it for that writing that I showed you. And it's really interesting. From a business point of view, there wasn't a one event or trade that changed. He built the business step by step, developing strong networks, learning from competitors, and utilizing his 14 children that he spread throughout Asia and Britain. And 2 things that were correct at the time are correct today: networks and information. Both are critical for the success of any business. This gives you an idea of the tremendous expansion. Notice it's a lot of port cities. The 3 hubs are the red stars. First Bombay, then Shanghai, then London. We're talking by 30 years after his arrival, starting from nothing, he was controlling that empire. One competitor put it in early 1860s, let me quote, "Silver and gold, silks, gums and spices, opium and cotton, wool and wheat, whatever moves over sea or land feels the hand or bears the mark of Sassoon and Co." One of the most interesting things about the family is philanthropy. They established something really innovative. Rather than give money at the end of the year if they had a good year, they taxed themselves. Each trade carried a tax, which they called a mitzvah or tzedakah, 0.25%. Now, 1/4% doesn't seem a lot of money, but if you're doing hundreds and thousands of trade, And if you look at their ledger books, it really comes like, chest of tea, cost, transport, cost, maritime insurance, and then the last line, always, tzedakah, which is 0.25%. Not only the Jewish communities benefited wherever they were, but also other places. This is David Sassoon when he was living in Bombay at the time, built this beautiful synagogue, Magen David, which actually is still a functioning synagogue and was renovated by the Indian government about 10, 15 years ago. The last few years before his death, he moved to Pune because it has a better weather, less humidity than Bombay. And again, he built this synagogue, and he's actually buried in its grounds. This is one of the things that are still today existing. You go to Mumbai today, and you tell any taxi driver, take me to the Sassoon Library. It's in the middle of Mumbai. It's a beautiful building. It's still functioning. It functioned as the first think tank that existed in Mumbai. He built also school for juveniles in Bombay, and there is a huge hospital in Pune, which is still called the Sassoon Hospital. 1864, David Sassoon died, leaving a huge fortune, equivalent to what is today about $5 billion. That is after 30 years starting from nothing. One of the things that was just maybe before that to mention, one of the most interesting things that in 120 years of archives and documents, never the question was raised between the members of the family and the employees, should we trade with A or B or not trade because of their religion or sect or nationality? Never, ever. The question was always one simple thing. Can we trust the counterpart? And you have to understand, they didn't meet their counterparts in the vast majority of cases. So reputation became very important, and hence the trust. And you see that in their emblem that was created later on, Emet ve'imuna, Candide et Constante, which really symbolized this issue of trust. And you can see all kinds of symbols. There is palm tree taken to remind them of Baghdad. As I said, 1864, he died. He left a very detailed will informing everyone that his old son, Albert, should take over as the chairman. The second son refuses to accept the edict. He says, I brought more business, I brought more profits than anyone else. It should be 50-50. 3 years of haggling and disagreements ended up creating two companies. From 1867, we have two companies, both carrying the name Sassoon, David Sassoon and Co., Edie Sassoon and Co. Victor Sassoon that you saw at the end is from Edie Sassoon. Abdallah, who became later on Albert, Sir Albert, because he was knighted, makes a huge decision. He decided to move to London. Why? Because other brothers were moving there. He wanted to be part of Britain. First, they wanted to be accepted in India. They got accepted in India. Then they decided to move to Britain and wanted to be also part of it. That's in 1872, he moved to England. But one amazing thing, he received this honor from the city of London. And at the presentation put it, this is the first time an East Indian merchant has been admitted to the honor highly prized by its possessor and much coveted by the aspirants to city fame. It is the first time that the freedom of the city of London has been presented to a Jew. Think about it. They leave in 1830s with nothing. 40 years later, the son is knighted, is honored by the financial capital of the world. And it was truly a tremendous honor and basically seemed to mark the zenith of a remarkable ascent from a Baghdadi exile. But that move augured something much more important: Anglicization. It became the real ideology of the family. So next came marriages into the aristocracies. This is Elaine de Rothschild. Actually, there is now at the Jewish Museum in New York, there is a Sassoon exhibition. I think you could see the real picture. Big houses everywhere. They started first in Bombay. This is today actually Messina Hospital in Mumbai. They bought this house in Pune, but then they moved to the best houses in London. And that really, because now they wanted to be part and parcel of the aristocracy. How do you become part of the aristocracy? You play by its rules. You have big houses, you have big estates, and that really changed everything. In the book you will read that actually Flora Sassoon was pushed out because the men in the family could not tolerate, unfortunately, her successes. And it's a long chapter that details all the shenanigans that the men did in order to push her out. And in a way, it really augured the beginning of the end of the one part that is David Sassoon and co. The other Sassoon found in that Victor Sassoon, he moved from India to Shanghai, built the first skyscraper in Shanghai. It still exists. If you go today to the Bund, which is the main street of Shanghai, there is the Fairmont Peace Hotel, beautiful building with incredible views of the city. By the 1930s, Victor Sassoon and the Sassoons owned 19 large buildings in Shanghai. Unfortunately, first there was the Japanese invasion, then World War II, and then the civil war between the nationalists and the communists, and it all culminated at the end in 1949 with the nationalization of all their assets. But as I said, the decline has begun. And this, to me, is a picture that shows you the difference of where they started and where they ended. This is an estate in Scotland. Now, there was a fundamental change, work ethics. I found this wonderful letter where the originals, David and Albert, worked 6 days a week, 14 hours a day. And then this letter in London from two members of the family saying, well, we went to the office in London at 11 a.m. At 1 p.m., we went to the club for a long lunch. And then at 3 o'clock, 3:30, we went to the horse racing to bet on horses. And I thought, okay, that tells you the story of what happened to these dynasties. And I will leave it there. Thank you. I think my discussant is coming.
Hi, thank you, Joseph. I just want to say before we begin, I think, Looking at those photographs, you can't help, or at least I couldn't help, but sit there. I couldn't help but think, as I looked at the photographs, what a reminder it is what Jews look like. We forget that those photographs, that's what Jews look like. And I think we sometimes, especially in New York, forget our own universality. And one of the things that I love about the Sassoon story is that they lived in these very exotic parts of the world, like Jews from Shanghai, from Mumbai. We don't think about that. Which leads me to my first question, because you have sitting here a Jew from Baghdad. So Joseph was born in Baghdad, and I wanted him to talk about how that influenced the decision to write the book, and how you think you approached it differently than I would approach it as an Ashkenazi American Jew.
Thank you. I actually talk about it in the book. I was really never interested in writing the history of the family. I remember very vividly as a teenager, age 11, 12, from time to time my father would say, "Let me tell you about the Sassoons." And I will put my fingers in my ears and run away, and he always did the trick by annoying him. Later on, when I was writing the book, I kept thinking, I need really just 10 minutes of asking some questions. Spend hours trying to figure out who's this, who's that. It didn't happen. I actually really did not think, and this book is also about serendipity. I had a fellowship at Oxford University. I was writing about authoritarianism in the Arab republics. I get out of the blue a letter. I didn't even bother opening the letter because I thought it's a joke. It's written to Joseph Sassoon, and the back of the letter it says, Joseph Sassoon, Western Scotland, from a village that I couldn't even pronounce it. I did finally open the letter. I did contact the guy, although it irritated me that there was neither email or a telephone, which meant I have to write a letter. But a contact was established, and I chatted to him. He's a gentleman in his mid-80s at the time, now in much older, but got the first book actually when the publisher finished it. And I went and visited him, and that was really the first trigger for me. He started telling me stories, showing me pictures, and then I thought, well, if I am in London, I can go to the archives. But the things that really convinced me is those documents, that treasure that I discovered at the National Library, where I realized there is an incredible story to be told.
One of the things that the diaspora that they represented, or that you represent as well, is very different from the Polish, Russian, Romanian diaspora to which I was raised. So when they're in Mumbai, there are problems in the community, and they contact the rabbi in Baghdad. They kept business records in, I don't know if there's a name for it in Hebrew.
It's Baghdadi Jewish dialect.
In Baghdadi Jewish dialect, but the Morgenthal's didn't keep records in Yiddish. And no, you stop and think about how the diaspora network was so different from the Ashkenazi network. Why do you think that was?
Well, I think that the life in the Ottoman Empire was really very different. I mean, they did not encounter anti-Semitism as in Europe. As I said, he was the equivalent, the father of David Sassoon was the equivalent of the Minister of Finance. He was the tax collector, but he was also what is called in Hebrew Nasi, the president of the community. And again, that is, actually during part of that time, which is 1820s, the financial advisor and the person running the purses of the Sultan in Constantinople was again a Jew from Baghdad. Remember, Baghdad was just a province as part of the Ottoman Empire. This language is really very important because it served a good purpose, but I argue also later on it served a negative purpose. The good side of it, it was impossible to decode it. Remember, traders were sending messengers, and there are 3 weeks on a boat, and they arrive to these foreign ports and cities. A lot of time, they sold the information. Guess what? No one could sell the information of the Sassoons because no one can decode it. Later on, I argue that it worked against them because it restricted the pool of talent. They kept having to go back to Baghdad to recruit people who know the language, who could speak it, and who could write it, which as the firm expanded, it meant you can't bring too many people from the outside world.
So really, in a sense, the difference is that our diaspora was about persecution.
Yes.
And I think we often forget that. And it's just are there other kind of fundamental structural differences between the diasporas? Like if you take the Al crowd people and you compare them to Sassoon, Safra, the Kaduris, the other structural differences other than the flight from persecution? Or it just seemed to me that they're very insular in a way. I don't know how to describe this. In a way, okay, this is my best example. So when they arrive in Mumbai, they're not the first Jews there. No. There were 2 other Jewish communities, but they didn't seem to have much to do with them.
No.
Why not?
Partly racism. Because
Can you back up and explain what the other communities were?
So there were actually 4 foreign immigration of Jews to India, some of it going back to the 15th, 16th century. There is a sect that is called Bnei Israel, which moved to India probably 14th, 15th century. They were dark-skinned. And the Baghdadis wanted to be identified with the British, and they actually wrote to the British time and again, they are different, we're different, we want to be treated as European. It was very, very important for them. And that is an important point too. They really wanted to be accepted in India in general, but seen as a community that is of its own, that is loyal to the British. The decision to identify with the British proved to be correct until at least World War I. But then things started turning south. I think the other important element is in all these things, the relationship that they built with Indian families is really truly remarkable. A family that still exists today and that I mention in the book that has been successful for all those years, they were friends and companions and co-directors in boards with the Sassoons, the Indian Tata family that owned steel, that owned Jaguar, that owned things. And they are really, that was kind of how Bombay it was, how cosmopolitan, yet they wanted to be also part of Europe.
It's just interesting because it also made me think, I wrote a biography of Golda Meir many years ago. And Golda used to talk about when she arrived from Ukraine to the United States, how patronizing the German Jews of Wisconsin were, and how they always were trying to make the the Russian or Eastern European Jews better. So, I mean, there was some reflection of it here, but there was no racial element.
Correct. Yeah.
So, within British colonial society in India, was there no racism?
No, there was a lot of racism. There is.
I'm sorry, I meant anti-Semitism.
No. There was. So this is really very interesting. They face some anti-Semitism in India, but not from the Indian community, not from the locals. It's usually from the Europeans or British. For example, there was a big hotel that was opened. Neither the Sassoons or the Tatas were allowed because they said it's only for Europeans. The revenge, the two families built a bigger and a better hotel 3 years later, Taj Hotel. I argue actually in the book that in a way, anti-Semitism was rampant in Britain at the end of the 19th century. And yet, I think that they were received better, let's say, than the Rothschilds. Why? I'll give you 3 reasons. First, the part of the anti-Semitism is about money lending. Well, they were never in the money lending business. They were never in the banking business. That already took away this stereotype of the money lenders. 2, the British aristocracy looked down at any family which is the nouveau riche, the people who start with nothing and get at the top. In the Sassoon case, they realized they came from riches of Baghdad. They were rich in India, at least when they started mixing with them, and they actually were called merchant princes. And therefore, they fit the criteria of aristocracy, different part. And last but not least, there was a movement in Britain at the time which allowed for a movement of people and experts and immigrants to be absorbed. And one of its patrons was the Prince of Wales. And the Prince of Wales became a very, very close friend of the family after a visit to Bombay. And here comes the Baghdadi hospitality. When they arrived, all these people, they knew how to cook for them and to treat them in an incredible way, which basically began an incredible relationship and friendship.
I was very struck, though, when you were writing about the relationship with the Brits by a piece of a letter that you quote, written by Winston Churchill to his mother on the coronation of Edward VII. I have it here in case you don't have to remember it. I am curious to know about the king, Churchill wrote. Will it entirely revolutionize his way of life? Will he sell his horses and scatter his Jews? Or will Reuben Sassoon be enshrined among the crown jewels and other regalia?
So the attacks were actually more about the Prince of Wales rather than the Sassoons. They kept saying to him, why are you mixing with those foreigners? And hence this thing that Churchill wrote, because it really bothered them that Reuben, one of Abdullah's younger brother, Albert's younger brother, actually they wrote how many times you enter the palace, was the second most the person who went in and out of the palace.
There's just a very, to me, a difficult to understand relationship between the Sassoons and Judaism. Because on the one hand, they throw themselves into being more Brits than the Brits. On the other hand, the Japanese invasion comes, and there are all, 70,000 Ashkenazi Jews. Do you know the story? If you don't know, maybe you don't. So, in the very early years of the war, Shanghai was one of the few open ports in the world where you didn't need a visa. The only. And so there were a large group of Jews managed to get out. And they reconstituted a community. In Shanghai, there were Jewish newspapers, delicatessens, bakeries. Think Lower East Side, it was the Lower East Side. And then the Japanese arrived, and the pressure came to ghettoize the Jews. The Sassoons were certainly not immune to the problem, but they were incredibly generous to these Ashkenazi Jews who they didn't really have much relationship with prior to then.
No, not much relationship. I mean, I guess through England there was connections, but Shanghai actually was the only city you didn't need a visa in 1940-41 when it was crucial to get out. And you still could get out, but then there were no visas anywhere. And so thousands began to arrive in Shanghai. There and the wealthy people in the city did help and take care of those communities. And I went before COVID to a conference in Chicago, and one of the people who was there is Secretary of Treasury Blumenthal under Carter, who actually was age 7 to 10, lived in Shanghai, and reminiscent about how basically his family and thousands of other families were saved.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if any of you saw it several years ago, several years before COVID. The Strikers actually showed a movie about the Jews of Shanghai, and the director was here, and they brought several Jews who grew up in the Shanghai community. I mean, it's a fascinating footnote that very few of us know very much about. It's I don't. In the book, you make it very real how incredibly thoroughly the Sassoons, I don't want to say controlled, had fingers in every corner of Shanghai. That if you wanted to buy a loaf of bread, can you do some of that for us so that people could understand how central they were to the life of Shanghai?
Yeah, I mean, there is this notion that Victor Sassoon had everything. You know, you wanted a beer, there was a factory controlled by Victor Sassoon. You went to a hotel, you wanted your clothes dry cleaned. It's all through the Sassoons. I think that they were really such an important element of the city. Victor, to the end, believed that China will find its way. Of course, he was totally wrong about it in the sense he kept saying they will never nationalize assets because they will need to trade with the West and they're not going to jeopardize that. Well, they did that. But they were really part and parcel of that city in an incredible way.
And so the decline in the family, so basically everybody moves to London, little by little, and stopped coming to work before 11 o'clock and probably had a few drinks over lunch. How gradual was the decline?
The money is, you know, it's actually hard to believe you can lose so much money. But it's actually not, mathematically, it's not that complicated. Let me explain.
Most of us want to ask the opposite question.
No, how to make it? Well, no, the adage is it's harder to keep it than to make it.
I wouldn't know. I never had any.
Okay, I'm telling you. The problem is, as they stopped working and earning as much money as before, inheritance, estate tax took 40-50% in Britain. If you have 5 children, it got divided. Now, all these beautiful, stunning houses that had they kept would have been worth tens and tens of millions of dollars had to be sold because none of the children could afford to buy their siblings. So one generation, think about it, half the X is gone, the other half is divided by 5. Each one of them have 2 or 3 in the next generation. Again, half goes to the tax, and it ends. There are still remnants. I mean, outside London in Kent, there is a still beautiful house not belonging to the Sassoons, but it's a stunning, stunning hotel. And you could see the grand life that they lived. This is a place overlooking from it. You could see on the other side France, and hosted the prime ministers of Britain and France after World War I, where they discussed the German question and about all the penalties that they have to collect. Gradual, very gradual. I think it ends in the 1960s, 70s, but there is really no one. There is no personality. Philip Sassoon, who ran for the last 14 years, was not interested in business. In those 14 years, I could not find one business letter in the archive. It's about art. He's an amazing art connoisseur. He sits and becomes president of the National Gallery. Think about it again. England, the 1930s, 40s. He's a member of parliament. He is undersecretary of the Air Force. No time for business, no time about the Sassoons. And that's when also this creeping thing is, in one of the houses that he has, they try to delete the Hebrew from the emblem because they didn't want to be identified with that anymore.
Which leads me to the question about their relationship to Judaism.
Totally change of in every generation. First, second generation, it was the identity. Whatever happened, however much money, it was their identity. They were Baghdadi Jewish. David Sassoon was religious. The sons were less religious, but definitely very traditionalist, and Baghdad and being Jewish was a dominant part. By the fourth generation, some of you might have seen the movie Benediction about Siegfried Sassoon, the famous World War I poet. He didn't know anything. He writes in his memoirs that the time he discovered what his roots are was at his father's funeral. He's 12 years old. He's not allowed to go to the funeral. His brother comes back home and tells him, they kidnapped our father. He says, what are you talking about? He says, there were weird men wearing weird hats, chanting weird language. Never heard that language before. He didn't know that his father is from Baghdad and it was Jewish. That is the fundamental transfer.
So they lost both their identity and their money.
Well, I argue that the loss of identity was a major factor of the loss of the money.
And that should be a lesson to all of us. Now, we have to talk about Farha. As Dr. Sassoon mentioned, one of the most interesting characters in this entire story is this woman who all of a sudden is running, and you saw the map, a global empire. And she's a Jewish woman from a Baghdadi family. Was she the last competent business person in the family?
On the David Sassoon side, yes. Victor Sassoon on the other side. She is really a remarkable woman. I mean, at age 17, she was learning 5-6 languages. Supposedly she could quote anything from Shakespeare, but she knew the Bible, the Talmud. She's a Sassoon, marries a Sassoon. 4 years before her husband's death, who was running the business in Asia, she announced that she wants to go to the office with him 2-3 times a week to learn about the business. It sounds simple. It was not simple at the time. It was revolutionary. The mercantile class in Bombay said, what is going on? What do we do when we go into the room and shake hands? Do we shake hands with her? 4 years later, he died. She announced she wants to take over the business. There was no one else. And she took over. And actually, she introduced so many innovative aspects. It's really, truly remarkable. Risk analysis, exposure to currency. She decided for the first time that letter that you saw, to change it. It has to be bullet points, and nearby there will be answer, yes, no, I don't know, or how much. Her departures definitely augurs the beginning of the end of David Sassoon. She was fed up with the family who could not accept her success and kept attacking her. Why? Because they kept saying, how can a widow with 3 children run a global business? The fact that they were in the clubs it was okay for them. But someone was working very long. Apart from running the global business, the family by then had 14 mills. She would visit one mill in the morning and another mill in the evening at the end of the day. It's interesting. Business was finished, but I want to just add, because it's about, she kept that identity. She later on moved to London, changed her name to Flora, and she was the first woman to be invited to give a talk at a Jewish college which ordains rabbis. And instead of thanking the people when she got up to the podium, she blasted them. She told them, let me ask you a question. It says that I got invited here because I am an able woman. You're telling me for 70 years you could not find one able woman in the whole world? And her speech was really, truly remarkable. It was a combination of Talmud, but there was a message. And the message was very clear. Whenever the men got stuck throughout the Bible, you read the stories, they went to a woman to salvage them.
So this is like a new Jewish heroine, right? It's for her. So much of the Sassoon success was built on opium. So, you want to talk about it?
Sure. I talk a lot about it in the book. But at the same time, I think you need to see it from the perspectives of 1850 and not the 21st century. Let me tell you what I mean. One, it became legal commodity. It was a commodity no different from rice or wheat or anything else for these traders. Two, something that I didn't know all these facts. Until 1907, you can go to any pharmacy in New York, in London, in Paris, and tell the pharmacist that you have a headache or a stomach ache. And most likely, you will be prescribed some opium. Three, opium was the biggest and most traded commodity for 25 years, quoted no different from gold or silver in every day in the newspaper. They were cognizant of what's happening, but they saw it, really kept trading it as a commodity no different from another commodity. But you have to understand, again, the atmosphere going around. Some Christian missionaries were fighting against it because they were convinced that if there is no opium in China, they could convert all the Chinese to Christians. In 1895, the British Parliament created a commission of inquiry. 5 years, 20,000 people were interviewed. I have in my study 5 volumes published by afterwards. The conclusion? This is all exaggerated. If you ban it, then ban alcohol. They brought something like 150 medical experts. All of them said the same thing. If you ban it, then you ban whiskey. Well, you can imagine the reaction in British Parliament being told that they're going to ban whiskey. So it's a problem. I talk about it a lot. I discuss it. I criticize some members of the family for it. But it was also a reality that is very different from today.
So now, I'm not going to keep going on. I want to know what questions you all have.
Here.
Who has?
Here. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Obviously, the Sacklers
That's it.
had the...
I have a mic for you, sir.
I'm sorry. The Sacklers had a similar, rise in power, wealth, money, and also started to give away a lot of their wealth. And today, obviously, it's a disgraced family. Did that ever happen to the Sassoons? And the other question is, tell me about your experience in Baghdad, if you had any.
Sure. No, there was no disgrace because it's really different things. They did not market it in the way that the Sacklers did. They did not industrialize it. They were buying from farmers and selling it. The farmers, there were 1 million Indian peasants at the time producing it and living on it. That's 1 million with families each of 6, 7. It was legal, as I just said. I mean, there was nothing illegal about it at the time, and it was seen as no different from any other commodity. We know today far more than they knew at the time, and so our attitude is very different. Yes, I grew up in Baghdad, so David Sassoon, when he escaped in 1830, his siblings stayed behind. I'm the descendant of one of those siblings. Family lived after all those years, but things deteriorated dramatically for the Jewish community after the Six-Day War in 1967. We could not leave anymore. We did not have any passports. There were restrictions being imposed on the community with regard to work, education, and as I said, travel. It got even worse after Saddam Hussein came to power because we were not allowed even to leave Baghdad, forget the country. So it made escape a double problem in the sense you have to get from Baghdad to the borders. Unlike one of the things that did strike me when I was writing the book, that destiny is really bizarre, that here I am writing the book 150 years later, and we end up fleeing Baghdad, also to Persia, also in the middle of the night, also leaving everything behind.
So I read the book. I highly recommend it. It was an eye-opener for myself. I congratulate you. I hope you try to write something about your Baghdadian life, because that is so unusual, and the history of the Baghdadian Jews is amazing.
Thank you.
I'm just going to interrupt. This is a total change, but I just want to mention it to you. In the 5 minutes we had before we came on the stage, I learned a lot about Baghdad. There's still 4 Jews left in Baghdad.
4.
4. And there is one person who is the head of the Jewish community. I just thought I needed to say, because it felt very Jewish to me. So it's just, I'm sorry, go ahead.
My name is Sophie Sassoon. I want to thank you so much. My parents both grew up in Mumbai, and I was the kid who would close my ears to my father, who passed away when he was only 59. So the stories were lost, and it was fascinating to hear you talk about them, because I could hear my father telling me the same thing when I was a kid, and I videoed it to tell my kids, because they won't put their hands in their ears when they hear it from you. I wanted to thank you. I'm curious to know, did you connect with direct descendants in England from the Sassoons you mentioned? And what are they doing now? And have they since intermarried? Because no one in my family married. We're all staunch, proud Jews. So some of us did survive the assimilation.
One of the joys of writing this book and giving a lot of talks is connecting to suddenly so many Sassoons. Yes, I did connect in London to some of them, connected to the States. I did an event when the book was launched in February at Rizzoli bookstore, and some Sassoons appeared there, which was delightful. In fact, yesterday, I received a phone call in my office from someone with an incredible story from also Bombay and Egypt, and is connected to the Sassoons, and it was just an absolutely remarkable. I mean, I was more dazzled by his story, but it's a great way of, maybe one day we'll have a big conference, all of us.
A family reunion.
A reunion.
Hi, thank you very much for an interesting talk. I'm curious to hear about the Sassoon family's views on Zionism and how they were affected by the move to Britain and views generally on the empire.
Thank you. They were not Zionist. They believe that they will give to the communities where they live in and where they work or have people working for them. So in Japan, in Singapore, in Burma, they really avoided giving money anywhere outside the places where they were not working. From time to time, on an individual basis, religious emissaries or rabbis would come from Palestine. I'm talking about late 19th century, early 20th century, and ask for a charity donation to establish a synagogue or a school, religious school. They did give money, but not for a political reason. And there really was very little connection to anything to do with Palestine or Israel, particularly having become so British. This did not come up on the agenda. And I think that the first Sassoon who really went and settled in Israel was only in the 1970s.
It's going to be interesting. We have two other families coming up. The Morgenthal's, where there was a lot of conflict over Zionism, and then the Safras, who avoided anything about Israel because it was bad for business until it became okay for business. So, I mean, the question's going to keep coming up as we explore these various dynasties. So,
oh, yes. In May, there's going to be an auction of a Bible that was owned by the Sassoons, and it's dated from the 9th century. I don't know if I have this exactly accurate.
Yes.
But could you tell us something about that? The estimated cost of it is somewhere between $30 million and $50 million. So,
50. It's actually not. It does not belong anymore to the Sassoons. Sold it to a Safra in the in the 1970s, the equivalent of $700,000. It's interesting. This goes back to Flora. Her son was an amazing collector of Hebraica. And when she was traveling around the region, he traveled with her buying all these Torah scrolls, old books. Actually, Christmas last year, Sotheby had the most incredible auction of Sassoons. And some of these items, like a Torah scroll from Yemen, was sold for millions. I am assuming some museum purchased it. This is really, truly remarkable, as actually was in the New York Times. it's 1,000 years old, and I am assuming he purchased it at some point, then his son sold it in the 1970s. Another bad trade.
More questions?
Yes, I have a question. Oops. Yes. Of the 14 children of David Sassoon, how many of them were girls? And did they also marry into the aristocracy?
No, that generation did not. The second generation, so Albert's son married into the Rothschild. Others started marrying into the Günzburg, the Polyakovs. That first generation, the immediate 14, were all married to Baghdadis, either from Bombay or from Baghdad. Their children, it's a totally different story.
But it was like a global shtetl.
It
Baghdadi
was.
Jews.
Yes.
Thank you for your story. It's very interesting. I do want to take exception to one thing, which is, opium, some of us were sitting here, opium may have been legal in Britain, but it certainly wasn't legal in China. It wasn't legal in China. The emperor had gone to war in the 1830s to try and eradicate it. And I just want to make sure that the audience, I think you're whitewashing I'm very glad that you wrote about it. The first thing I did is look in the index, and you've got a lot of stuff on it, so I think that's important. But I think it's really important. Some of us lived in Shanghai. There's a group of us right here. In Hong Kong, so we've been in Asia a lot. But I think it's important to remember. And, they could have had doctors come in and 100 medical specialists say that, but so did the tobacco industry. Right?
Yes.
Same guys.
No. You're absolutely right. But I just want to add one thing from an economic point of view. There are, and it's in the book, it indicated, every time the production from India went down, the local production in China of opium went up. And in fact, by the 1900s, there was zero exports from India, but the amount consumed in China did not go down because the local production took over.
No, it's a very interesting part of the book where you grapple with this question.
Absolutely.
And I think the tobacco is a good example, and so are the Sacklers.
Yeah.
Right? It's there's another question. I can't see where it is, but
Here, there, yeah.
she has a mic.
Hi. I had read in the book The Last Kings of Shanghai that David Sassoon had put in his will that his children had to marry Iraqi Jews or Baghdadi Jews. Is that correct?
No, that's not in the will.
It wasn't?
No, the will is in this language, so I don't know how it was decoded. It does not say anything. It talks actually about his assets. It talked about philanthropy. It talked about the loyalty to his son after his death. It's a very interesting will in the sense of it allocates clearly how all his daughters will have the different rights to the different assets, and his wife to be taken care of as long as she was alive with regard to houses and payments, but it does not state that. I think that was kind of expected when he was. I doubt that anyone would have crossed their mind to go to David Sassoon and tell him. I don't think they met anyone else. That's also the society they were. It's very cosmopolitan, but not when it comes to marriages.
Are there more questions?
Are like old soldiers? they never die, they just fade away. So I'm interested in the epilogue, which is who's left, what are they up to, other than you. We see you up there and Cecily back there. Yeah. Who's left, and are they even Jews today?
Yes, I mean, I can't generalize. Maybe when the reunion will take place, we'll invite you. But I think there are in different businesses. I met medical doctors. I met different people in different businesses. Some identify very clearly with the Sassoons, others indirectly. Maybe this book is a little bit reviving some of the, longingness to become a Sassoon. There is really no such, there is no group anymore, I think, because there is no business, there is no assets, there is nothing. It's just now a name. I tell at the end of the book that really the only place where anyone would know the name is actually only Mumbai, and followed by Shanghai. But other places, less, unfortunately.
So you're not going to have this reunion in Baghdad then?
No, well, maybe, if you can arrange for that.
We were talking about this earlier, what an incredible trip that would be.
I have a question for you. The family had very great wealth. Did they have political ambitions? Did they use their wealth to have some type of political agenda in the various countries they were in?
Yes and no, in the sense, quite a number of them entered politics. So the son of Albert, who married to the Rothschild, actually became a member of parliament. Philip Sassoon became an undersecretary. He definitely had political ambitions, and he was very close to a number of prime ministers in Britain and angled for getting a much bigger job, but undersecretary was the top. Other ones, no. There was actually another interesting personality, and that is another woman, Rachel Beer Sassoon, who in 1916, although women could not vote in Britain, she was the editor of a national newspaper. In fact, at some point, she became the editor of 2 national newspapers, which is really unheard of anywhere else in the world. No, they did not. They were not really looking for these things. And most of it, anyway, in Britain at the time, 90% are professionals. There are no such thing as political appointees. Very good question, and I talk about it at the end of the book. She's asking about the Kaduris in Hong Kong and why didn't the Sassoon not go there. So actually, the Kaduris were one of the people that, because of this language, when they went to Baghdad, was recruited. He came and worked for the Sassoon, and a lot of young men at the time thought this is in a way to create fortune, because they have heard about the success of the Sassoon. So he worked for the Sassoon 7-8 years, and then left and set up his own business. To me, the comparisons with the Kaduris is very important, because they suffered even more during World War II. They were interned. Victor Sassoon managed to get out before the Japanese occupied fully Shanghai and Hong Kong. One of the biggest mistakes that I argue in the book that Victor did, he did not go back to Hong Kong. He had assets, he had agencies, he had real estate. He sold it all at a low price, while the Kaduris really started from scratch again in 1945 and managed to build an empire.
Well, I'm getting the word.
There's one, yeah.
Then we'll do one more question. Go ahead.
Okay. Yes.
My question is, how were the Sassoons accepted in the society in London? Or were they accepted?
I think they were. I mean, I think to a large extent, their friendship with the Prince of Wales opened the doors for them. You saw that picture, in Scotland. They, hobnobbed with the aristocracy. They hosted them. They played by their rules, really. And there was here and there some words of anti-Semitism. There was some criticism. There was all kind of nasty comments made. But overall, I think they felt that they have achieved what they wanted and aspired to be, which is to be accepted by the British upper class.
Thank you, Dr. Sassoon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You should know that Dr. Sassoon will go out in front and is available to sign books. And we hope you'll join us. Let me see. Next week we go to the Ashkenazi dynasty of the Morgenthals, including our DA, and then on to the Safras. So I hope you'll join us again. On behalf of the Stryker Center, thank you.